This is The Convergence.
All right. Well, hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another episode of The Convergence, where every week we talk about Web 3.0 and its convergence with sustainability. I'm really excited to have Michael Carter here with me today. I don't want to say he's the foremost Bitcoin mining expert in the world, but he's the foremost Bitcoin mining expert in the world, at least as far as YouTube is concerned, right, Michael? I mean, you've been doing this for a long time.
Yeah, so I first made that YouTube channel in 2013. So there wasn't any other mining channels out there that was kind of doing a regular episodic kind of setup to where it was trying to make sure that people could engage in the space. And this was in a time where it really wasn't about like money. I mean, there was an idea of like what Bitcoin was, but it was really about like security of a network, being able to have no single point of failure, have, what the core value propositions of what crypto and blockchain technology in general was bringing. Circumstantially, there was Bitcoin and there was a token, there was incentivized to participate, but it was around that concept of like, how do you get more people to participate and that sort of thing. So yeah, that's where it came from, and been around since. 880 plus videos, over 3,000 hours of content online, just trying to educate and teach people, all organic. We don't like pay for advertising or anything like that. Yeah. It's just, what you see is what you get. We have lots of 2-hour plus live streams on just mainly mining content by and large.
Sure. So let's talk about mining, because I do think, and I'm relatively new to this space as well. I've been on the peripheral a little bit. I've helped create one of the first metaverses back in 2015. So I've understood it from a concept perspective, but mining, I have to be honest with you, I keep thinking it's like you're out there with picks and shovels someplace. What is mining? What does it mean? Like how did this idea of mining come up about?
Correct. So it's one of the key components of what Satoshi, that wrote the white paper for Bitcoin, came up with from a consensus standpoint. So what he solved was the Byzantine general theorem, where if you have in a distributed network and you want to create messaging in between that distributed network, how do you guarantee the message? Right? How do you know that it hasn't been altered or changed? And what's happened is in a consensus network with like Bitcoin is you have this, everybody has a ledger, everybody can self-verify the contents of that information within that blockchain. Everything is predicated on the previous block. To uphold that and to create the activity that's on any blockchain is you have to have a consensus mechanism for Bitcoin and coins that are mineable. What that is a competition, and that competition is looking for the ability to find whatever a nonce is. So at the end of the day, to break it down to English, it's a competition for people to participate in this thing to get the rights to mint the next block. And what would be inside of a block? Think of a block like a shell, like a train car, and you're wanting to have all those transactions pushed into that train car. So the miner that wins that opportunity gets the rights to be able to get the inflation of the said currency. So in Bitcoin's, and when Bitcoin first came out, it was 50 coins per block. 4 years later, it's 25 coins per block. 4 years later, it's 12.5. And now we're in that, that next cycle, which is the 6.25. In 2 years, we'll be at 3.25. So that's the incentive. So the miners are upholding the network from that aspect. They're the security layer. So if you were to take everything I just said and said, I'm still not tracking, think of mining as the security of this distributed network. And for that security, you're compensated in a token. So it was the incentive to try to get more and more people to secure the network. And the ledger, which is your debits, credits side of it, that structure to make sure that there's no change to that. People can't go back and make an alteration. The more mining secures that. So you can think of it like that in that aspect. So yes, why I said there was some complicated stuff to the left of it. At the end of the day, it's the security blanket for the network to make sure that you would need more than 50% of all the mining in total in the world to make a change to that ledger. So it's like a force multiplier kind of situation, right? So the more miners there are, the more secure it is. And then there's a kind of a macroeconomic side to it when it comes to, if Bitcoin's at a certain price, you're going to have a lot more participation. If you have price discovery, more people want to mine because you have more opportunity to share in that yield. And then Bitcoin has this awesome mechanism as an example, and most all proof of works have these natural mechanism because they don't know who's all going to mine, right? So it has to figure out how do we create a timing on when to do these blocks. So it creates part of that game of what the miners are playing, and what's that difficulty of that problem is it starts off to say this is like a number line. If we remember number lines in school, that number line gets a lot bigger if there's a lot of participation, and the miners are trying to find one dot on that number line, but they're working on sections. So if you were just to highlight just a part of a number line, each miner's like taking shots at it, and then one of them find that number and they go, I got it. Right.
It's like it's like pay dirt and gold mining, right? You're digging holes and you find one that has pay dirt. That makes a lot of sense. Okay. So then how does that, I came from the oil industry, so I understand. I worked in the oil industry, did work around sustainability for them for a few years. And when oil prices were high, there was a higher incentive. When oil prices were low, lots and lots of rigs shut down. Is that the same correlation in Bitcoin?
Yeah, absolutely. So what ends up happening is there's only so much. So the Bitcoin difficulty is predicated on how many people are mining. So what ends up happening is Bitcoin has a target block time. That's 10 minutes. Okay. So what happens is that number line thing I was just talking about, that's the difficulty of the problem. So if Bitcoin's price comes down too much, then people are going to start to shut off. And what happens is now the problem becomes so difficult because you have all these miners out there, it readjusts the difficulty, which then says, I'm going to try to keep it at a 10-minute block time. So like right now, as we're in 4 or 5 days from this recording of this podcast, the Bitcoin difficulty is going to adjust. The average time has been around 17 minutes. Well, it should be 10 minutes. So what that means is that some people have started to already turn off. We're starting to kind of get into a bear market. So it's it's a mechanism of people will start to dial that off, and that's controlled by who has the highest cost on, their power costs and that sort of thing, right? So as those people power off rigs, they might not necessarily sell them, but they might power them off. Then less people are mining. So the people that continue to mine are getting more yield, right? So you have this yield play. And so whoever has the lowest cost operations are the ones that turn off last, and they're actually getting more yield as this difficulty comes down.
Yeah. So in a lot of senses, it is similar to oil well drilling oil wells in the sense in that drilling is you have a P&L for that well, and you have your fixed costs and your variable costs. And if your variable costs get too much or the cost per barrel goes too low, it no longer makes financial sense to run that well. So, that is it's a great point. And I think it's why I think so many sustainability people are starting to look at things like blockchain and say, hey, this is something that actually doesn't have as big of a carbon footprint as maybe people think it does. Because for the most part, the guys who are mining right now are mining pretty much off the grid because the cost of energy and the cost of,
Yeah. And I get a lot of the ESG concerns, and I think people should, I've always taken it from an aspect of we're a consumer, and there's a lot of things that Teslas consume a lot of power. At the end of the day, there's roadmaps, and those roadmaps to get to sustainability are best options to move, off of the coal or clean coal or any of that kind of stuff. There's already roadmaps. Those companies that are those power maintainers have, 7, 8, 10 year. We're working with one here locally that's working off of clean. They're moving off of clean coal by 2030. They already have a roadmap, and what they're coming to us and saying with a more sustainable power use, right? And we can more flatten that line on we can guarantee because you're going to be a high use 24/7 user, as long as you're interruptible because of like peaks and valleys of a situation. If we can work out a thing, we can accelerate our timeline, right? So they're looking at like, it's more revenue in the stream for them to now be able to deploy to move their timeline faster. And it's a value add for us because we're like, hey, if we can get to, there's solar farms, there's hydroelectric, we're next to the Mississippi River. They have options there from the lock and dams. There's a lot of opportunity to move that. I think it's having that ability to go into an area and turn on Bitcoin miners for us to be able to participate is critical, and to help move those timelines and make sure that the focus is, on the ESG front, that we are providing the revenue that helps move those timelines.
So let me ask you, let's talk particularly about one aspect of Bitcoin that I did not know when I first started the show, and that is that it is a finite resource.
Yeah. So on like with Bitcoin, it has a limited supply. So it's going to be 21 million Bitcoin in total. There's about 19 and some change out there now.
Oh, wow.
And that's the inflation rate to a final state. But the blocks continue to still get built. Sure. And the transaction fees that happen within those 10 minutes, because there's an inflation rate that bumps that amount up. It halves every 4 years. But then in between that also, like right now, if you look at a current Bitcoin transaction, it can go from, the normal block reward will be 6.4, 6.8 total block or total money to the miner. Well, 6.25 was the inflation, and that delta is the fees. So what ends up happening is we hit this point around that 2040 time frame, 2044, where it's going to get to where the fees are the majority of the actual rate that the miners are earning. It's not even the inflation of the Bitcoin, right? So this is all of these models that you see on the dips and valleys, and that continuous upstream is that at the end of the day, as Bitcoin becomes more valuable, it becomes more scarce and drives that value up as people start to use that for utility. You'll see that the fee structures in between are really sustain it for that point. And then once that 21 million coins are fully produced, we're talking the year 2140. So our answer.
Oh, is that far? Wow.
Yeah. 2000. No. Yeah. 2140. I mean, we'll start to feel that kind of normal effect in around 2040, 2044, because you're going to have where like right now, it's going to go from 6.25 to 3.125. And then it's going to have again in 4 more years. And then it's going to have again. Now we're going to be under 1 Bitcoin every 10 minutes going to the miners. You're going to be at a state where potentially transaction fees are actually more every 10 minutes. So the majority of it's being upheld by just the transaction fees.
Sure.
And you do have other networks like Ethereum that doesn't have an upper bound, an upper limit. It's not a fixed supply, but Ethereum has burn functions, right? So like the basic premise of that is you have Bitcoin from, the supply, and its base core, asset is the limited scarcity of that. You can look at it from a long-term investment kind of aspect versus like Ethereum is more of like, it's an EVM. It's an Ethereum virtual machine. It's like, think of it like an Amazon where you build apps and services on. And for that, the ether is the fuel. So you need this constant fuel source because some of that stuff's going to get locked up and held forever and come out of the supply. So you would have this weird disincentive over time.
Yeah.
If you kept doing that activity and less supply, because then it would become too expensive to use the system. And we've already kind of seen the kind of early effects of that. And Ethereum's trying to adjust some things where we had some crazy fee structure this last year, right? Like you go to try to mint an NFT on Ethereum in certain times, it was like $600.
I know. I've been buying some NFTs of one of my favorite artists, Jay Pierce, who's been on this show and has been very successful in transitioning. And every time it's like the NFT is cost less than the gas. And it's like, shit, this sucks. Yes. Right? It's like, oh my God, I found one for $50. And then I look at the gas and I'm like, and the gas is 75. I'm like, wow, okay.
Correct. So Ethereum's kind of lending us what the effect of like the way the gas structure works and the way the transaction fees, because the gas is the transaction fee in Ethereum side, but Ethereum has the burn function and it's had a monetary policy to reduce its inflation because it started at 5 coins per block and they have a 15-second block time. So you would have 4 blocks in 1 minute. So you had a lot more inflation in Ethereum, but also you don't have, Ethereum set at all-time highs this last year at 69,000. You had it at 4, right? So you're going to have a little different inflation mechanism there, but like it's also what's the point and the purpose. And it from a utility, I would put Ethereum on a very high utility aspect, right? Same thing with like the proof of stake networks that aren't mineable, that are using the concept of you purchasing coin and then holding it and then becoming a validator, different kind of mechanism. Still out on the fence if that's going to be a long-term effect because there's other existential things that happen.
Can you go to a little deeper and can you talk about that a little bit more? Because I didn't follow that. So that means that I feel like I'm not an expert yet. I feel like I'm like the beginner. So if I didn't follow it, I have a feeling that most of the people listening didn't. So if you wouldn't mind explaining that a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. Like, so with the consensus stuff that we were talking before. So the mining is the consensus for like Bitcoin networks. Ethereum right now is still also mined, where you're taking pieces of hardware, you're committing those to run that, you're feeding it power, and it's supporting the network. For that, you're compensated in a token. That's aspect of mining. From a consensus mechanism of staking, different concepts. So instead of having CapEx into hardware and having to power that device, you're changing it up to where you're saying, I'm going to run what's a node, which is the ledger. And within that, I'm going to have a state where I'm going to put a certain amount of coin into it and I'm going to lock it up. And then that gives me weight because I have invested capital. And what I'm saying is I'm not going to move that capital. I'm going to have it work for me. And that working for me becomes a validator. So that function that the miners are doing, that win the block, the validator's effectively doing too. It's looking at the memory, what's happened on the block and moving transactions in and creating a new block. It's just, instead of having hard device plugged into power, you have a coin that you're essentially speculating that value is going to go up and that the inflation is going to be worth something. And it's a lot less energy use, but there's a different kind of mechanism of risk when it comes to like, is there going to be a centralization of that? Because the difference between mining and just buying coin, we know we could just get online and buy coin, right? And what's the risk factor of like a larger entity buying a whole bunch of coin and just now running all the stakers versus it's very hard for people to deploy hardware, right? That's why you have such a diversity of this. And then you don't really have, any one place that has all the miners. You have it all over the world naturally because of the supply. So it's a conflicting consensus thing, but at the end of the day, there's several networks that are functioning as proof of stake. We have you have Polkadot, you have Cardano as a proof of stake network with validators. So I think they all have kind of they're just competing technology stacks at the end of the day. But the network value and stuff is really what matters, right? At the end of the day, what matters on what their value add is. So
maybe you can get a little bit into that the verbiage of token versus coin, and are they separating or are they really the same thing? And maybe you can give us a little insight.
Think of like Ethereum being your iPhone, and think of the token utility as an app on your iPhone. And to use and operate the functions within that app, you have that token. So their value proposition from the token side is, we built this thing, it's going to do X, and for you to interact with it, you're going to use our token.
So I want to talk with you for a few moments about Evergreen Carbon Credits, one of the sponsors of this show. I started working with Evergreen when I was telling a friend of mine who's involved with that company about my efforts to try to learn more about blockchain, NFTs, crypto, all the things in this space. And he showed me Evergreen. Evergreen was a really unique solution. I've looked at carbon credits in the past. I've been in the sustainability industry for almost 15 years. I understood what they were. You were buying an offset to offset the carbon footprint that you or your company has. But I also understood the challenges with that. They're sold in very, very large blocks, and then people break those blocks up and try to sell individual credits or small clusters of credits to businesses. And that creates some room for fraud, for people to not be up and up on what that project is, if that carbon credit is real. And there's challenges with that. And you can Google it right now and find there's a big case in Europe going on about fraudulent carbon credits. But what Evergreen did, I thought, was really unique. They took this idea of NFTs and they took blocks of carbon credits and broke those things down into tens of thousands or even millions of individual carbon credits. They can actually fraction those even out to a tenth of a carbon credit if they needed to. And they were able to then create a smart contract around that carbon credit so that you can track it back to its origin. You can find out what project it was associated with, but you are also guaranteed that the carbon credits you're getting from Evergreen are the real deal. You get that certificate, you get that certification that only the blockchain can do. So that's why it made sense for them to come on as a sponsor of this show. We're talking about all this new technology, and with new technology comes higher energy usages in some senses. And Evergreen is here to help offset that. If you want to look to maybe improve your image in the marketplace, maybe you're looking to offset some of your carbon footprint, not even just for your image, but actually for the sake of the planet. head on over to evergreencarboncredits.com and check out what they do. You can buy credits for as little as $11, and you'll get the certificate and the NFT that you can put in your wallet that shows that you've actually made that contribution. And that money, particularly right now with the projects they're working on, is going to reforestation in the Amazon. I think that's something we can all really get behind, particularly when we understand that the environment, the climate we're all connected to it. It doesn't matter if we're putting off emissions here in the US or if it's happening in Mexico. It all contributes to the same global problem. So why not be part of a global solution with Evergreen Carbon Credits? I did a lot of work in the oil industry years ago, and the oil industry gets a bad rap, and I think there's lots of reasons for their bad rap. But we always think about who are the shareholders of these big oil companies. And I'll never forget, I was at lunch with the president of one of the biggest oil companies in the world, and we started talking about this, and he said, if you looked at who our shareholders are, he's like, I have the names, I can literally see every entity, and he's like, yes, there's a few big entities that hold large portions of this company. And he's like, but when you look at that next block, it's teachers unions, it's your grandmother's pension fund. What did he say? It was something like 73% of the 401ks in the US had his stock in it. And he's like, so who are the true shareholders of this company? Well, it's me. And I remember when Michael Moore came out against that company, and they went into their database and found that Michael Moore owned shares in the company. And they were like, bro, you're going to bash us, but yet you're getting a dividend every single quarter. And I remember Michael Moore, when, the documentary filmmaker, was like, I don't own that. Looks in his portfolio and he's like, son of a gun, I do own it, and I own it in multiple different places. Now, Michael Moore was smart, because the next board meeting he showed up and said, I'm a shareholder, don't I get a seat? And good for him. But it does go to show what's going to happen, I think, is you're going to start to see it fall into these ETFs and 401ks and IRAs. And some of that started to happen in the last, I would even say like the last 60 days. But I think with the market condition change, nobody's promoting, come and get in our Bitcoin ETF now.
It's the time to get it, right? It's a cycle to get it. But, the way the psychology works and just the volatility, it's hard from a risk aspect, but we're really close to the lowest risk indicators. So I'm imagining it's going to start to stay flat. I don't think it'll go much lower, but like if we look at just the fundamentals, and we'll actually have a live stream on this tomorrow. We have a local thing here that we're doing and talking like what to do in a bear market and look at it. And I look at it from like, has anything regulatorily changed? No.
Right.
Is there any new laws? There's things in flight, but there's nothing new laws.
Yeah.
All the fundamentals that drove it up to 69 have not changed. But I think the aspects when it comes to the over leveraged positions, the visibility that leverage positions in crypto provide compared to traditional finance, where we can see what the positions on Aave are, we can see Curve, we can see MakerDAO, we can see these areas where there are leverage positions, and they're attack surfaces, right? So it's a lot of game theory that goes on, and when you can see the order book, things can happen. So when you look at algorithmic stablecoin with like Terra as an example, didn't have large enough reserves, got it, and it got taken down. So it's one of those things that I think there's some discovery. And I know Kevin O'Leary covered this a few days ago at one of the DC summits. And I like what he was saying. It's like, he sees part of this sector, not all of it, because there are some definite aspect changes from some of them, but part of the sector could become like the 12th index on the NASDAQ, right? Where it is a different thing that is correlated partially on the utility side token stuff, because it has a direct correlation to an effect on some big like emerging tech markets, but like there's certain other sovereign asset stuff, which, Bitcoin doesn't care what the US doesn't care what any one country does. Bitcoin's going to survive with or without anybody on that, because there's staunch supporters of Bitcoin that will always be there and looks at it from a value proposition of transfer. And I mean, you just look at some of the stuff like out of Ukraine, you look at some of the stuff where people were able to move their capital that they had into Bitcoin, walk across the border, and be able to redeem their capital without banks, right? When you lose infrastructure, there's a huge use case in this. we don't feel it in the US because we have a very structured system and that has capabilities, but in capabilities around the world that don't have that, it's a very powerful tool.
We had a guest that talked about Cardano in Africa and how the adoption of Cardano in Africa is completely revolutionizing the entire continent, because for the first time ever, people are bankable. When you live on $1 a day and an ATM, transaction fee is $3, you're done. Like you can't do that. But when the transaction fee is so low and you've got a debit card and it has your $1 a day, now you're a bankable person and you can go and buy real estate. You can do these kind of things. And I think that's what this decentralization does, is it gives these opportunities for entrepreneurs to really flourish.
Well, and it changes the way the overhead works, right? So I always like breaking it down into like, why does this functionally work and why is it, I wouldn't even say better. It's just like in some ways it's complementary to the existing system. And then some of it is directly in competition with it. But the complementary piece of it is an overhead side. As a developer, a single developer, you could come up with a smart contract that performs a service and you deploy it. And then I don't have to pay AWS fees. I don't have to pay like infrastructure fees. The network already is incentivized to uphold what I just created there. And then if people interact with it, it changes the entire aspect of that. So like somebody being able to get an SMS on their phone and be able to move money around and not have to worry about search seizure kind of issues, or if something politically changes in their country and then there's a shutdown of the institutional side, they still have their capital. They could literally go somewhere else and redeem it because it's setting on that global blockchain. It's not setting in an institution within infrastructure, right? So there's fundamentally, like when people are like, oh, it's all going to go to zero. It's like, no, man, like there's a functionality, there's a use case and a functionality that may not coincide with what you would consider with like traditional finance or attacking fintech. And it's more visceral around somebody that does not have a capability that we have. And that's going to still exist for them, and because they're going to use that for transport. So like that's what it comes back down to, a fundamental. That's the fundamentals when I talk fundamentals.
Well, I love the fact that you talk about fundamentals, because it's something that I've tried to instill in the listeners of this show too, is, think about these things as utilities. Don't just think about them as currencies or coins, right? Think about what this does. And I think we talked a lot about crypto in this, but the blockchain in and of itself, that underlying technology is really where it's at. And I've heard multiple people now. We just had a university expert the other day that said 10 times bigger than the internet, at full deployment, 10 times bigger than the internet. And I'm like, what? But you can see it once you start to understand the utility of the technology, it really changes your perspective.
Yeah, it does have the opportunity to be an augmentation in a lot of areas. And I think people over time have learned it's not just about trying to replace some existing system. In some ways it's complementary. So you can have systems of record, like certain things, like it was kind of the joke about dental coin and some of these other things like medical records and stuff, like certain things you're not going to want on a blockchain. However, you will want the fact, because you'd want to have the privacy and stuff there, and the privacy tech isn't all the way there yet. Yeah. To put it on a blockchain. So you don't want that on there. However, it would be nice to have some aspect of medical records from a verification, state status, things that are not relatively to the PII information on there, but the fact that something's occurred or it's with somebody in a cycle or a process step, that I'm leveraging that network, not having to have some kind of interface agreement with some big company, like that they're using it from a dashboarding aspect. And then there's just a small, fee for them to use that. But now I have direct access and I don't have to have some kind of passkey or login or password to get into some system that I'll forget. And now I'm maybe potentially compromising myself when I was just trying to get a status update, but now somebody got into my account and sees all my personal information, right? So that separation and segregation of like important, like personal information, and then having the things that keep getting us in trouble, like from a security standpoint, to where there's a key gateway into the thing. And then now you got access to the whole kingdom. Let's keep the things that are private and important, like super secure. And then the things that are dashboarding, or we want to give companies access to certain information, have that as mechanisms to, create rails on. And, people would look at it like, well, that seems like a lot. Well, on a blockchain, it's actually not that complicated, because you're making one view of that on chain that many to one companies can subscribe to. And now you have this whole like essentially a bus that's on there that people can, and when I'm saying bus is a developer term. It's like a middleware bus.
Right. Yeah.
You have a
Middleware.
bus that everybody could subscribe to. And I don't need to get to people's personal information. Right. And like, that's the next phase of evolution. I start to see this as is the augmentation, where people get away from trying to just replace the whole system. And they go, you know what, certain aspect of this, maybe we shouldn't touch because it makes sense not to have like all this personal information on blockchains, but we want to have some of those mechanisms for access to maybe get deleveraged where you're just getting certain states of information. And then you can leverage Cardano or any of these other these smart contract based platforms to leverage that kind of stuff. And I think that's kind of your next phase. Yeah. And, is there a token associated that generates revenue? Yeah, possibly.
Maybe not.
Maybe not. And then, but the base layer currencies, because of the activity, and that's the other thing. It's like all these tokens, when we were talking about the difference between the crypto token and then like the subsequent token, not everything needs to be worth money. Some of it's just the function and you're paying that underlying token for the money side of it. And then the other thing is for just the mechanical redemption.
I was looking to see if I had one here, but here we go. Yeah. This is actually, I've worked for some defense contractors in the past and doing some consulting work, and they do these coins. They do mission coins at the end of a project. They literally hand you a mission coin, and it's like, okay, there's no value to this at all, but there's an incredible value to it, right? I still have this. I got this one in 2011, and it's still sitting on my desk.
Yeah, it's an acknowledgement thing, and it's not even like it's just it's a moment in time that's been captured. And I think that means that has very, value to you know what that means to that. And I think that kind of stuff and the tagging of that, when we start to say, what was our accomplishment? I mean, I've seen this, there was a really good one that I unfortunately never came to be like one of the small startups that was trying to do this. They were trying to do that same kind of thing with like those mission coins, but like badges for like, things that you did throughout your career and things that you could capture. And it was a very quick way to condense, like if you're in a resume and you're going for a new job, you would have this like verifiable public opportunity to include things like that. And they would all have like this issue ID. Yeah. And then it would have like the little badge. So it was almost like we've gamified, the endorsement. But the point of it is saying, at the end of the day, what's the validation that somebody issued that? So that if they had a mechanism or a rel to be able to give awards and stuff and then tag that with somebody's wallet, you treat it like an NFT. Why it doesn't have necessary value to anything else at all. The value is in the fact that informationally you can say, I participated in these things and I did these things. And it leans out the ability to have to explain anything like, oh man, you got this credential, and then it's done. And like, you can do that with certifications and all this stuff. And I told them, I'm like, I think this is brilliant because like, if you think of like, if you're hiring people and they're like, oh, I did this, and this, like you could really lean out like the accreditation and then just hear the stories of what progressed them.
Well, listen, Michael, thank you so much for being here. I got a great education myself. I need to actually go back now and listen to some of the interviews I've done because now I understand what the heck they were talking about. But this was so good. Thank you so much. Be Trippin is your website. Be Trippin IO, right? And then
.io is the website. Yeah, if you just Google that, you'll find us. We have a service center. We do stuff for like ASIC repair and GPU repairs. We have our mining farms. We show everybody on all the aspects, and then talk something like this, like on different events here. So we're doing one in St. Louis tomorrow down at our headquarters downtown. And it's a meetup and free beer and soda and food and all that. So
let me see if I can catch a flight. St. Louis. All right. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, we have those every couple months and stuff. So yeah, it's
that's awesome.
Just here to help the space.
And I love that about even your website too. I know you guys even give like free advice where you just have a mailbox and you're like, send it here. We'll spend a couple hours a month giving free, but you also consult on setting up these rigs. So if you're interested in any of these rigs, check out betrippin.io. Thank you again, Michael. Hey folks, thanks for tuning in, and until next time.
Thanks for listening to The Convergence. If you want more information about the topics you've heard here today, reach out to us at theconvergencepodcast.com.